Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Thinking Ahead, Why Growing a Developer Community Matters. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Jesse Davis. As Chief Technologist, Jesse is responsible for guiding the strategic direction of the Answer Hub product and helping customers build the world's largest and most engaging developer communities. Jesse has been building enterprise software and engineering teams for 20 years and is a respected executive, author, speaker, and coach. He developed the first data access for Java and served as an expert and innovator on industry data standards, including JDBC, ODBC, and ANSI SQL. Jesse loves building and growing teams and individuals to reach their full potential. Jesse holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Engineering from North Carolina State University. Jesse, over to you.
Awesome. Well, that was quite an introduction. Thanks, Suha. I did want to start off and remind everybody that today we are going to be covering the beginning of how we developed communities, where we are in terms of the developer market. We're going to look at some demographics and psychographics of developers, what's going on in the industry. Then we're going to move into community best practices, some tangible real world stories that you can use to implement and build a highly engaged developer community on your own. And then we're going to talk into real, actionable, tangible ROI. How can you prove the value of your community to your managers, your executives, and your company, and why it's so important? So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I did want to show a couple of things. This is me, one of the two good pictures that I've ever had taken of myself in my entire life. I've been doing this a long time, and I believe that right now, one of the most important things that we can do is help grow the next generation of developers. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. The reason why is because we live right now today in a world made out of software. And if you look at the continuum of history, at certain critical points, specific professions became essential to the world at large. For example, right after the Revolutionary War, and even during the Revolutionary War, lawyers and legalists were really critical because they could construct laws and frameworks in the Constitution. You fast forward a little bit to the Industrial Revolution, and you have civil engineers, mechanical engineers, urban planning. These became essential professions at the time. And now, I believe that the most important profession on the earth today are software developers. Never in the continuum of human history have a handful of people located primarily in Silicon Valley, California, had so much effect and influence on what we all do when we wake up first thing in the morning. We typically turn some phone over and access some piece of software. And so it's important for us to understand that when you look at successful companies, right, we tend to look at the Fortune 500. Over the last 15 years, half of those companies have disappeared. And the average corporate life expectancy is dropping. It used to be 75 years. And now we're looking at 15, moving to 14 years between now and the next 5 years. Not all companies experience this, though. Some companies are growing, so we're going to look at that for just a second. Amazon, for example, reinvented itself with Amazon Web Services. No longer was this a company that just sold books online, but now they're one of the world's largest online cloud computing platforms. Likewise, IBM, also known as Big Blue, used to be known for computer systems. And now one of the most prevalent things that is associated with IBM is artificial intelligence through the Watson AI engine. This happened back in 2006 and 2009 for these two companies, respectively. They reinvented themselves around something new. And that's happening right now, today, in the world at large. And we need to dig into some of this because all of us want successful companies. So what's the common thread between these two? What did Amazon and IBM know years ago that we're just now finding out today, and what can we do to make sure that our companies continue to grow the same way? Well, the first thing is we look at this group called the MIT CISR, or CISR, Center for Information Systems Research Group. They monitor what's going on for information systems, computing, and everything all over the world. And they have this framework for digital transformation that they constantly review. And you'll notice over here, there are what they call the 5 building blocks of digital transformation. And I would say Amazon, IBM, and any other company that wants to continue to be successful must have these 5 building blocks. The first one being operational backbone, making sure that they have the systems and the processes in place in order to be able to do business. Voice of the customer, what we're calling here shared customer insights. Things that they learn about their customers and the end users of their products. Are we bringing that inside the company and sharing that with everyone so that we get alignment on what our customers needs? The next one is that we have a digital platform. Every company is a software company nowadays. Insurance companies have thousands of developers. 56% of all developers employed right now, today, work for non-software companies. That's banks, insurance, any of your FinTech, retail, you name it, they've got developers because it's essential. You have to have some kind of digital platform. The next one is some kind of accountability framework. This one makes a lot of sense. Anyone who's a fan of making sure that companies work well, building teams, understands that you have to have accountability. But I want to focus on this last one for just a moment. The 5th pillar here, the 5th building block, is a developer platform. And this is specifically because every company is a software company, you have to have developers. You have to have developers in your company building your products. You have to have developers using your products. If you have APIs you want to plug in. This idea of having software work together to be able to make something, make some kind of workflow or process flow work smoother is with every single company. And so this idea of a developer platform, we're going to explore. And we're going to start by looking at developers. I promised you earlier that we were going to see, what's going on in the market, and this idea of digital transformation. It's been around for a while. But what's interesting is most companies have not implemented all 5 of those building blocks. They're still trying to figure it out. And I'm hoping some of you on the line today are going to be trying to figure that out, because we have some ideas that are going to point you in the right direction so that you can make that transformation complete and continue to grow your company. But when we look at developers, it's important to understand that we don't just want to look at the demographics. We're always looking at the demographics for things, but what's more important than understanding who developers are is what do they think? What do they believe? What do they need? And what do they want? Because if we can figure out a way to meet their needs where they are, we can succeed. So I'm going to dig into this first with some demographics. If you take a global look at developers, right now, we're talking about 23 million on planet Earth today. Now, what's interesting, and I'll throw this statistic in there, for every employed software developer, there are 5 job openings. 5. And at the current rate that we're graduating developers anywhere in the world, we're not going to meet this demand for global developers in the next decade. It will take more than 10 years for us to get enough developers to meet the total technical demand of the world right now. So where are they? Well, the largest populations in the US, followed closely by India, which we believe will overtake the US in terms of having the largest developer population by 2024. China is the fastest growing with 6 to 8%. And what's new about this slide, I had this slide last year, I updated it now. Latin America is experiencing really strong growth in developers. So these are things that we're going to keep an eye on. Some other interesting facts about developers, almost 80% of developers are married. Again, talking demographic information. The median age is 34. I did this talk at Developer Week a few weeks ago, and the median age for developers I think it was back in 2008, let's say 10 years ago, was 47. That number continues to drop, continues to plummet for several different reasons. First of all, we've got more people graduating with a computer science degree or computer engineering. Second, we have a lot of people coming into development from other jobs. So we have people going through boot camp, people learning how to do development themselves, again, because there's those 5 job openings for every single employee developer today. So median age continues to drop, and 19% of developers are female, right? Anytime you go to a talk, and this talk that I did at Developer Week talks a lot about hiring in for diversity, right? Females used to be a much higher percentage of developers, and that dropped off over time. 84% believe that robots will not turn against us. I always go out on a limb and say I completely disagree with this statement. Anyone who thinks that the AI is going to be benevolent, you and I should sit down and have a cup of coffee. I don't think that that we should be playing around with some of that stuff. But I'm glad to believe that most of my brothers and sisters in the development space believe that we're going to be okay. You'll look here, 53% have advanced degrees. This one's interesting. This number has actually increased, where I assumed this year it would actually drop due to the number of boot camp graduates, but some companies are actually doing more of the tuition reimbursement programs, which is floating this number a little bit. And then last, this one is big, and this is going to get a little into psychographics, but almost every single developer has taught themselves something new within the last 12 months. It's fascinating for us to understand that developers by nature are lifelong learners and problem solvers. This is who we are. So now, as we said, we want to dig into our psychology. There are 3 big things that define developers. The first of all is that they're very creative, right? Turning chaos into order. I like to say that, the magic of myth and legend is alive in our time right now today. One must only need to utter and type in the correct incantations on the keyboard to make the screen spring to life and obey your every command. This is one of the reasons people get into coding. It's one of the reasons I got into coding, because I had this little mechanical slave that would do my bidding. I would tell it to calculate, very impossible things to do on a calculator. I would have it loop through, hundreds and hundreds of rows in a database back then. Now it's billions of rows in databases. We can do natural language processing. The ability to use these machines to do things that we ourselves would take, hundreds of years to compute in fractions of the time is one of the reasons that we get into it. And so that creativity, that ability for a developer to see beyond what's right in front of them and imagine a better future is critical to be a good developer. Another thing is what I would like to call is an unhealthy obsession with problem solving, right? Developers glean very little bits of feedback from their work every day. Like, take, for example, fixing a bug. Fixing a bug is a very, very small victory. However, a developer can glean an immense amount of joy out of that one tiny victory. What's interesting is that one bug fix can keep them through the next 15 to 27 hours of debugging where they're banging their head like this fella over here, or face palming. That's a double face palm, actually, on the last paragraph. The ability to deal with unending and never ceasing failure and grinding frustration is also one of the key tenets of developers. It's funny when you think about the developer each and every day sitting in front of their machine, coding and coding and coding. We need to think through their experience, right? Developers are constantly fixing problems, which is good because they like it. However, what they deal with every day is a compiler or interpreter, depending on your programming language. And that compiler is the most uncaring, toxic, almost abusive coworker that you could imagine. You're doing your best to type in the code and get this problem fixed. And the compiler sits there when you try to build it, or the interpreter if you run it. You push the button and it says syntax error, null pointer exception, incomplete statement. All of these errors that come up for developers, they're constant. And not only does the compiler, the interpreter not care, it grinds your face in it. It's almost like it sits there, laughing, looking out into the window in the distance. It doesn't care if you succeed or you fail. It's completely emotionless. And developers have to work with this toxic coworker each and every day, which results in, now the next slide will be a little bit funny, but it results in an emotional whiplash, where at one end of the spectrum, you finish something great, that a large amount of joy, you stand up from your desk, your hands go up in victory, and you shout, "Behold all of the mighty things that I have wrought today." I've seen developers, they get that excitement, there's high fives, there's people encouraging them, and then the other side of the spectrum is, "Oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing." Right? These emotional highs and lows, they feed into the psyche of a developer and what they look for and what they need. So if you look at a hierarchy of needs for developers, they need tools, they need processes, and they need structures that allow them to smooth out some of this emotional whiplash. Because if you can reduce the amount of the time that a developer feels like the dog on the right here, and get them feeling more like this space commander here on the left, you're going to increase developer productivity quite a bit. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about a little bit more today, are some practical things that you can do. But when you look at this emotional whiplash, it's interesting to think that this changes how developers see themselves within an organization. And you're thinking to yourself, what do you mean, Jesse? What is this? What are you talking about? Well, developers, remember, they sit together with this, I call it the same coworker, that toxic compiler, whatever. They feel like that's their coworker more so than sometimes the person sitting beside them. And what's interesting is when they talk to other developers, they feel more of a sense of kinship or connection to other developers, regardless of what company they work for. And I want you to hear that, because it's different than if you're in a sales organization or a marketing organization or some of these other things. Developers will go out of their way to help you solve a problem, especially in like an online forum or something like that, regardless of whether you work for the competition or not. To them, the more important thing is about solving the problem. Again, that unhealthy obsession with problem solving really feeds into how developers behave. So when we look at how they want to behave, they want to find ways to build peer-to-peer relationships with each other worldwide, so they can collaborate and work together to solve problems. That is one of the biggest takeaways. If you don't get much else out of this presentation and all the other rambling I'm going to do on markets and stuff, I want you to drive that one home and make sure that you put that one in your back pocket. That's a key to understanding how developers behave. A lot of business folk don't grok it, or they don't get it, or I'll talk to a developer relations expert or somebody running, a community for another company. And when we talk about developers, we have to create these online spaces where they feel like they belong. And this is one of the biggest things that we can do. So right here is an interesting statistic from Evans data. It shows that developers care just as much about giving back and contributing in their broader, developer community worldwide as they do about money. And when you think about the journey that a developer takes, we all start out, when we're learning how to code, we all start out like that dog. We really don't know what we're doing. Source code is actually a language. We call it a language for a reason. It's no different than learning Japanese or Italian, or whatever. You have to understand that, and you have to be taught. And the best way to learn a foreign language is usually to learn it from someone who knows it already. And so there's usually a mentor or a coach or somebody who's pouring into you. And when you learn that way, it feels good to give back. And so by providing places where developers can do that, you can make a big difference and meet some of their needs. The other reason developers like this is they expect you to have community, because it makes them write better code faster, right? All these numbers on the screen can just be summed up that way. Have that fifth building block of digital transformation. Have some kind of place where developers can gather and collaborate together, because it makes them better at what they do. Developers want to get the code written. They want to get the bug squashed. They want to use more and more of your API, but they don't necessarily want to hear from your marketing team. They want to hear from other developers, their peers who have done it before, because that's the standard way that developers learn, whether they're new developers or they've been doing it for 10 years. Everyone will look at your documentation and other stuff, but when someone engages with them and answers a question online, it's powerful. It forms a connection between those two individuals that's real. Community is a human trait. Humans want to have community. It's built into who we are. You know, wherever you go on the face of the earth, there are always groups of humans that gather together, whether you are up in the North Pole or you're in the middle of the Amazon. We gather together because we seek that sense of community. And in this specific case, it makes developers do more of what they love. So I want to look over the last few years, because people think, oh, this idea of community is new, and I disagree. The first communities were built way back in the 1950s with a lady who was known as, this is Grace Hopper. She was known as the first lady of software, but she was working on the UNIVAC system. And the UNIVAC system, these are magnetic tapes and there's no internet and it's hard to share. So what she did, she sent out a bunch of code on these magnetic tapes with a note, a handwritten note, said, hey, if you have other code to share, send it back to me and I'll make copies of it and make sure that I send it back out. And that's the first time that we had code sharing in a community of developers. They were sharing these things over magnetic tapes. Again, it's a humanistic trait, so community is not new. It's been around for over 70 years. Now, if we look at, how developers progress, I mean, you've got up here the mainframe era, you've got client and server. For those of you who lived through it, that was an interesting time. Then we moved from what we called pre-web into the web and mobile, and that's when things started to accelerate. I mean, there are books on how fast the world is changing and how much data we're generating and how do we process it. And, the answer to a lot of those problems, and a lot of those your companies will have, but the answer to a lot of these problems has been developers, right? We have to write some kind of code to fix this. So it's interesting to look at the DNA of developers over this time span so that we can kind of understand how we got to where we are today. So if you look back in the 50s and 70s, these are your pioneers and explorers. These are people who were not coders by profession. They were scientists. They were doctors or lawyers trying to compute some data for a research paper, right? And they would go into the lab and they would write some stuff up. And back then, it was I'm not a career developer. I'm developing for a specific purpose. I'm trying to get something done. And then you would use the computer as a tool, just like you would use a screwdriver or something else, and then you go on back to your day job. Now that began to change a little bit later when we had what we called hackers. Hackers, everybody has seen the quintessential hacker in a black hoodie, sitting in a dark room, illuminated only by the glow of their keyboard, typing furiously, trying to crack into the Pentagon or whatever, pick your favorite hacker movie from the 80s and 90s. This was a real thing, though. Hackers were activists back then. So they would try to figure out how to do what's called fracking, where you would hack phone systems by using special dial tones and, do long distance numbers. For those of you who remember, long distance actually used to be a thing that you would get charged for. So, that's where we started having that community. And it changed dramatically because there became an association with being able to and a fascination with being able to manipulate these machines in a certain way. And that led to what we call the experimenters. Once you had widely available computing for the masses, never in our history have we been able to test what we call the infinite monkeys experiment as we were in this time. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people would start buying up these computers and just coding whatever they wanted. And it turns out at the time, what they really wanted were video games. Video games became one of the big things. You had video games in the arcade. This is the birth of your video games, game systems at home. Think about your Ataris and your beginning Nintendo systems. Developers at that time started to begin to build in entertainment. And what's interesting is and I don't have time to go into it in this webinar, but if I ever run into you at a show, let's grab a coffee, because it's fun for me to put the juxtaposition between this experimenter age in the frame of history and what was going on in history at the same time that we would cause people to focus on entertainment and escapism. But regardless, this is when we began to do experimentation, and that experimentation not only led to video games, but the success of those video games showed that people could make money at it. And so people began doing office productivity tools, spreadsheets, databases, email, all of the communication, chat, all of this stuff started to explode around us. And then that drove a little more need for higher grade developers. So we got into this idea of a 10x developer. The 10x developer, the beginning of the 2000s, it was the idea that you could build a whole team of people around this developer who would know the entire code base. They'd come in, they were a superhuman, they were super fast, they knew all the ins and outs, and that was okay back then. But the problem is software has become way more distributed. It's also become more complex. The idea of microservices architectures and all of the other architectural things of being distributed led to that 10x developer just can't do it. One person cannot typically manage what we would call enterprise software today. And so now that we're in the cloud and mobile era, we believe that team-based is where we are. So the birth of agile methodologies, how to break down tasks, how to work together as a team. This idea of doing smaller releases faster time to market, right? The speed of change is constant and constantly growing. And so you need a team of people working together in concert, which changes the requirements for how you build teams. It's not only your job to find and build a team of developers, again, whether they're internal or external, that are really great at coding, but they also have to work well together, and they have to have the tools where they can collaborate and achieve great things as a team. So when we look at that, I usually have a spiel about how developers hate marketing, but that's not necessarily true. I don't believe developers hate marketing. I believe developers hate bad marketing, irrelevant marketing, things that don't help them. And so Seth Godin's famous for this quote that I have up here in his book, Tribes, but we don't need to be marketing to developers. We need to be building communities or tribes of developers. That's what's going to change the equation for your company and for all the rest of them. So when you look at what that means, it stands to reason that developers' growing influence in business would rise as they became more prominent and important, right? That statistic I led earlier where there's 5 job openings. But what's interesting is developers' control of budget has increased over time. Now 41%, we're almost approaching 50% of developers now have some kind of purchasing authority and power within their company. And almost 3/4, right, 73% of developers meet with senior management to have input on what systems we should use, what the values of those systems are, how we evaluate them. Online evaluation tools and things are skyrocketing in terms of importance. But the bottom line is all of this text on the slide just goes to say that the developers are the new kingmakers. Developers have a lot of power in every company, and you need to figure out how to harness that power. So when you're building a community, it's important to know that you're not just building a community of people who are going to use your product or developers internally who are going to build your product, but you're also increasing their ability to make good decisions by helping them collaborate with one another. So if we keep going, this responsibility that developers have, right? I can't help but make a Spider-Man reference when we talk about responsibility, right? So with great power comes great responsibility. There, I said it. So we look here, and it's interesting to me when you look at developers, 41% have less than 5 years of experience. And I tell people that it's usually pretty shocking for them to see that this is it. And this is directly from the latest developer hiring survey. I think it was the Stack put out. But you look at this, and people who have been coding for more than 20 years are starting to retire. They're starting to do other things. And so that means that we need to have ways to capture this knowledge that's leaving it, pass it down, and help grow developers faster. And this idea of all of these communities or these tribes, as Seth Godin put it, That's a good way for us to be able to do that. And we already know that developers believe that community, you should have one, and that they're going to participate in it. So this is going to be something that is directly correlated to you having a community, is the ability to have stronger, better developers playing with your code and building your code, right? And so now I want to get into some practical stuff, right? We've set the table. We understand the importance of community. We understand the importance of developers. We know what's going on in the market. So what are those practical steps that you can do to not just reach, but we really want to engage developers, right? We don't want people just coming to our communities and not participating. We want a vibrant, healthy community. We want people giving back. We want them contributing, answering questions, writing knowledge-based articles. And so the first thing that you do is you have to go where they are, right? And so anyone in the development space knows where these are: GitHub, Stack Overflow, Reddit, Slack. This is Hacker News, DZone.com, and then there's a bunch of individual communities that you could look at, like Unity or Amazon or Epic Games. And so by going to these places, you can find the developers, that's where they are, and get them to come back to your site by focusing on the human elements of what they need. Again, one of the big things that we need to provide for them is productivity. When a developer is heads down coding, trying to solve a problem, that unhealthy problem-solving obsession turns into, hey, I need to ask a question. They'll go online, they type a question. Hopefully, it's for the community that you've stood up for your fascinating product on using your API. They're able to ask the question and they get a response. And instantly, just like that, they're engaged. They're engaged with you, they're engaged with your company, and you're helping them out. And they will continue to be engaged. Developers are highly loyal if they believe that what they're getting is valuable. So if you continue to provide valuable spaces for them where they belong and can do better work, they'll keep coming back. So again, having a Q&A section is essential. Another one is developers like to be heard. They like to contribute and make the products and tools that they use better. Think of how open source software works. Think about the Java community process. Developers love to give input and give back. They'll contribute their time. They'll contribute great ideas. And you have to provide a space where you can do that. So some kind of ideation engine. Product managers love this. This is a key for product managers within an organization to have direct access to the community of developers, either inside or outside of your company, who are using your product and want to give you good ideas. Product managers, you don't have to go it alone. You have a whole army of people who want to tell you the good, the bad, the ugly, and make suggestions on what your product can do. So having an ideation module where you can vote on the most wanted features is essential. And I think Amazon does a really good job of this, by the way. The last one is developers, again, like to give back. They like to learn and share. They love to write tutorials. They like to write articles on what they've learned. So you need to have some kind of way for them to provide and give that content back to the community. Developers love to hear from other developers. So the more developer content that you have out there written by developers using your product or internal, the better engagement you're going to get with that development community. And the last thing is specialized social networking help. So these are ways where developers can go in and tweak their email preferences, right? Some developers like to be notified every week. Some want a summary every day. You want to be able to do that. You want to be able to follow anything. I want to be notified when someone follows my question. I want to follow a specific question, or I want to follow a specific group of questions, like a space or a specific topic. I want to be able to change the view and the way I interact with that community to my preferences, right? And that's one of the things that you need to provide in any community that you put out. The next thing is, when you're thinking, now that you found this product that has all of these great things in it, you understand the value that it's going to give to you, you have to understand, how do you design your community? Now we're looking at community philosophy. And some of you said, Jesse, this is where I'm going to peace out. I'm going to drop out of the webinar. Please don't, because I've got some exciting ROI calculations later. But this is more than just philosophy, right? This is thinking through how you want developers to interact and think about your company. So the first one, what do you want them to think? Should they think positive about certain things, neutral about certain things? How do you want to handle awareness in your community? What do you want them to feel? This one's a super interesting exercise. If you've ever designed software, anybody can throw some code together. I'll be honest, I have a 16-year-old, he's learning how to code. He can, rip out a website, he can put together some back-end logic. It's not the coding that's hard, it's getting the philosophy right. It's getting the developer to feel the whole idea of developer experience, user interfaces, all of this stuff matters. And so when you sit down and you're building this community, you got to think, what do I want developers to feel when they come here in this place? We want them to feel valuable, engaged. Do we want a little bit of humor in there? I know people who have built communities and they want people to laugh every time that they come to the site. And so they'll put Dilbert cartoons or things over on the side panels. But it's about understanding what you want for your developers to feel when they come to your community. And then the last one, of course, as I sit across the table from my marketing team who's looking at me, they want to make sure that the developers are doing something, right? If you're in marketing, I'm going to say the word, call to action, CTA. What is it that we want developers to do when they come to a site, right? Maybe we want them to download a piece of software, right, to try it. Maybe we want them to make a recommendation. Maybe we want them to vote on some kind of idea so the product managers are happy. But think through these three things whenever you're trying to come up with how I'm going to build and design my community, because these things are important. The other one is make it fun. This one is something that I recommend for everyone. You have to have developers come and make it fun. There's so much stress in that emotional whiplash we covered earlier that you've got to have a little bit of a reward system. And I'll tell you, it's interesting. Everyone wants our virtual lives to mix with our real lives. Anyone who, participated in that whole Second Life thing that happened, a few years ago would relate to that. But, it could be something as simple as you earn awards and badges in your community that you create T-shirts and you print them out on the arms of the badges whenever they get to your conference. You can do bonus incentives for your developers who participate in your community internally, the one who gives back the most or answer the most questions. Super swag, like things from the marketing closet, leftovers from conferences, run some games and have people actually win something real that they've done in the online community to make it fun and make it relevant for them. The last one is you want to make sure that you're integrating in with existing workflows. So here, for example, developers and support, specifically, if you're looking at an external support community, you want to make sure that it integrates in with something like a Jira or a Zendesk or Slack or whatever. Here, you can take a question that's been asked and one of your support reps says, hey, this looks like a bug. So you can immediately put it right into Jira. And on the page, it'll show you the Jira state and synchronize it with the question. So every time someone comes in, if they have the duplicate question or, hey, I've seen this problem too, they can see actually the status of that issue as it exists in your online tracking system for the backend, which is super interesting. When you're thinking about building these communities built around support, these external communities, you have to think in terms of what people are going to find value in. Again, that experience. We want them to feel like they've been heard. And people feel like they've been heard if they can see a specific bug ticket and they understand where it is, right? That also reduces the amount of emails your support team has to deal with, which is great. We take a minute away from the external side and look at the internal side, right? So first of all, 85% of all the questions that are asked throughout the day have already been answered. And so you're wasting tons and tons and tons of time, and you're frustrating people by having them answer the same questions over and over. Wouldn't it be great to have those questions captured somewhere so someone could search for the question and then automatically see the answer? That would be awesome. So eliminating duplicate question, that's a no-brainer. The other one is reducing interruptions. So this one is a University of Irving study, and it's I don't think it's every 11 minutes, otherwise the math wouldn't work, but on average, people spend about 11 minutes on a task before they're interrupted. And then the time to get back on task usually takes about 25 minutes to get back into the flow. When you're in that zone and you're just getting stuff done and time loses all meaning and you're just being super productive. So, this idea of not disturbing others was great if you have a place where they can go, where they can ask their questions and not have to tap somebody on the shoulder, because it's not real time, it's time shifted. I can ask a question in an online community and someone can answer it, in 2 hours, and I'd be happy. And that prevents me from having to bug somebody else when, we've got a system in place to handle those. The last one is it makes for faster onboarding. So we have this thing internally, we call it the coding dojo, where developers, most companies take several weeks or even a month or two to get up to speed and to be able to be fixing bugs and understanding architecture. But we have a place where we have all of this stuff online. People come into the company, they spend the first, week reading all of this information, and we have what we believe, our mission, vision, values. We have the architecture of the product, how you debug it, how to set up your environment, all of those things set up and ready to go, so that onboarding time is dramatically reduced, and people can come up to speed and be contributing members very, very quickly. And so that's one of the things that you want to think through, especially for these companies who are hiring lots of developers. The faster you get them in and the faster you get them onboarded, the better off you're going to be. So now I'm going to get into some math. So please don't fall asleep. We're going to do simple math because that's about all I can do. So we're going to look at the number of questions. I used to have a big development team, and I say big, but it's, for those of you with big enterprise companies, it's not. It's about 150 developers, and they ask way more than 3 questions a day. But I use 3 questions here because it's easy and it makes my numbers look really simple. But say it takes 30 minutes to research a question, and we'll just say maybe it takes 10 minutes with a community. And so you're saving about 20 minutes or an hour per week per developer. It doesn't sound like a lot. But if you've got a larger development team and you can save them an hour a week, right? And again, these numbers are more on the conservative side. You're looking at a savings of 5,000 hours a year. And as someone who's run developer teams, if you were to ask me, what would I do with 5,000 extra development hours? We're getting close to 3 FTEs at that point. I can say without a shadow of a doubt that putting a developer community in place to help facilitate communication between a developer and a support team internally is extremely powerful. When support doesn't send your developers emails and walk over to their desk and ask them where something is, they can just do everything in a community with SLA set up. It's super powerful, and it results in much higher levels of productivity for your team and reduces duplicate questions. It also captures everything to be reused in the future. So that knowledge that you've got continues to build and grow over time rather than rot and pass away. Next, we're going to talk about external developer communities. Again, hard numbers, real numbers. So I've showed this slide. This came from a relatively older study, but still within the past few years, of Forrester on the future of customer support and success. And when you look at that number, every time I've shown this slide, every single time someone's sitting there saying, tech support, when you have to call me, is way more than $12. It's way more than $12. And so I said, that's interesting. So I challenged the study a little bit and tried to do my own math. Again, remembering that I'm not the best at math, but assume you've got, a couple thousand support tickets and your support function costs $82,000. This is a resolution for support cases. Now, I'm not going to say this could be an average of those cases that are deflected to your customers, or this could go to be a defect in the software. Those are going to be much more expensive if you have to go actually fix a bug then. But just take this as an average, right? We'll say this is an average cost. And assume that we can only deflect or reduce costs by 35%. Numbers that we've seen are in the 30 to 40% numbers. If you do it right, you have a very active community, people are participating, you can get higher than 35%, but we're just going to assume a more conservative number. So every time someone picks up the phone, it's $37, which is it's a little bit closer. It's more than the 12. And we'll provide you a spreadsheet so you can actually do this calculation on your own based on real numbers in your company. But if we have a 35% reduction, that means that we end up with a monthly savings by looking at the phone support cases going down to $14.30, and the cost of support ends up being $53.3. So your monthly savings is $28.7. That's not bad. That's not bad. We're not talking about head counts, right? We're not talking about, being able to stop, making sure that you've got people doing, 10 other things, but it's a little bit, right? Now, I will say that even at $28,700 a month, that's quite a bit per year. I mean, you're looking at $344,000 per year of annual savings if you can get a 35% reduction in your call volume, which is pretty significant. So the other thing that I would like to point out here too is, we have some communities that see ROI that's really, really big. And the trick comes in being able to scale your community, right? And so I'll give you an example. Unity, one of the largest providers of online gaming software for people to build games for mobile devices, they grew from 2,000 to like 1.7 million in their community over a very short period of time. But what's super interesting about Unity's case study is they focused on community. They focused on making it simple. They focused on providing some of the basic things they needed, and the developers took care of the rest, right? Once they provided an environment where developers could come and help one another build games, right? Just like you might have someone come and help build financial services and APIs, they were able to build an active community that resulted in a lot of activity and content from the developers themselves. So they were able to offset huge numbers of support costs. They were able to feed that feedback from that back into their product management. And this was during, the growth season for Unity, which they still are having rapid growth. So being able to build a community like Unity or Amazon or some of those other ones, these are the things that we're trying to get you to, is understanding where we were in the very beginning, where we talked about why developers are so important, why their rise in influence has happened in companies, what they like, where they are and who they are, and then how to provide an online space where developers can belong and be a part of something is what we think you're going to be able to, you're going to need to do to be able to be successful in this developer market. So I hope you learned something. It's always very different for me to be in a webinar. I usually like to do these in person. I've been doing this whole thing to my marketing team. I hope you didn't leave and that you're engaged. But now we're going to open it up. So if you have any questions, I would love it if somebody has a question for me so I can feel like we're not just talking to the wall in here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Suha. If we have any questions, lay them on me.
Thank you so much, Jesse. What a great presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, you still have time to post your questions in the questions panel. I've received a couple of questions that I'm going to go over. So someone asked, I work for a FinTech company, and I've been seeing a trend in developer communities in the FinTech industry. Can you explain why it's becoming a trend and why it is so important?
Absolutely, that's a great question. FinTech has started to pop up for a lot of different reasons, but mostly because any type of bank or financial institution, first of all, has to have an online presence. They almost all have to have some kind of mobile software to be able to integrate in with their backend systems. And then for those of you in Europe, you're very familiar with the laws over in Europe where, on the backs of GDPR, which was more about personal information, they believe that your financial information is also part of your PII. So you have to be able to share that between institutions through APIs. And so now almost every financial company and financial institution or bank is becoming an API company as well. And so you're going to see a growing demand for developers in the FinTech space, regardless of whether you're insurance or banking or whatever it is, trading, algorithmic trading is coming up, but software is at the heart of everything we do. And there's just a growing need for that in every industry, but you're seeing it in FinTech, and those are some of the reasons why.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And there's another question. Do you have any advice for syncing efficient and keeping up with questions between company forum And Slack. Oh.
Yeah, the other one.
And
Stack Overflow.
Stack Overflow, yes.
Yeah, and so that is a huge issue. One of the things that you're going to want to look for is for a Slack integration between your Q&A system. To be perfectly honest, that's what people need. Slack is, I have opinions of Slack, being a community guy. If you look at how Slack is typically used within organizations, it's mostly for direct one-on-one communication. And then even things that happen in channels, it's really hard to go back and mine that. So that knowledge is usually between the people that were in the conversation, but it's not stored in a community. And so what you can do is you can put programs in place to make sure people are using your community. I've seen companies do that. And there are companies that even tie participation in their communities to people's bonuses, right? You're talking about changing people's behaviors. The other one is to find a piece of software that has a Slack integration. And what typically will happen is you'll post a question on the community, and that notifies a Slack channel and gives a link so that they can go back to the community to answer it. So that's how you're going to be able to do that. Stack Overflow is a little bit different. You could approach that by doing a federated search, but what's interesting is Stack Overflow usually has questions that are more general rather than specific about a product. Some companies do have like spaces and things out on Stack, but what we tend to find is companies tend to want their developers to go to Stack for general programming questions, and they want to keep them on their own Q&A sites to be able to answer questions about their own products, whether they be internal communities or external. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you so much. We have another question. If my company sells B2B software to a very narrow market where their total community size is less than 1,000 at best, and currently around 50, where many are direct competitors, does it still make sense to have a community?
It's a great question. So B2B software, just trying to repeat the question in my mind, in a very narrow market where the total community size is less than 1,000, the answer is yes. I mean, if you've got less than 1,000, that's still 1,000 humans that would need to find a way to collaborate in some way, right? And even though the market space may be small now, you don't know if it's going to grow. You may actually know, you're probably more an expert than I am, but what I would tend to say is we have internal communities very successful with people, 200, 300, 500 people in it, right? I mean, I had one when I only had 150 developers and saw tremendous ROI in saving that stuff. And so, regardless of how many people, I mean, 1,000, that's still probably a good way because that's 1,000 people. I mean, think about getting 1,000 people in a room, right? It'd have to be a pretty big room to have 1,000 people capturing knowledge, being able to reuse questions and that kind of thing. So I would say yes. That's a good question.
Certainly. Now, we have another question. What tools would you recommend if you're getting started with creating a developer community?
It's a great question. I'll do a shameless plug and think that you should use Answer Hub. But no, seriously, it's a good question. So whenever you're thinking about a community, I want you to think about tools in a more broad sense as well, right? So one of the tools that you should have in your arsenal is, yes, a Q&A platform that has ideation and knowledge base articles, right? Try to find one that has all three. Don't be the company that puts together the Franken developer site, right? So you take a Frankenstein approach and you get Q&A over here because it's cheap, and you get some ideation module or feedback thing over here, and then you buy a separate KB module. You want to make sure that you get as many tools in one as possible because it reduces the number of tools you need, right? The other thing I would say is in terms of your tool stack, you're going to need some kind of bug tracking software because developers are going to find bugs and issues in your code, and you want to be able to track it aside from the ideation, and then be able to plug that bug tracking software into your community. So like I demonstrated earlier with Jira, for example, which is super popular one. The other one I would say is not going to be a software tool. It's going to be programs. You're going to want to put together some programs, which is, I did a panel a heavy bit panel weeks ago, and one of my friends in the community space, I like to approach community from a software tools perspective, but they like to approach it from a more humanistic perspective, which is, go to meetups, meet people locally, be where the developers are, not just online like I showed you before, but be at the conferences, host the parties, do the meet and greet and the birds of a feather. All of that stuff is super powerful. For every online interaction that you get, you're going to need 10 of those at least to get the same kind of impression as a face-to-face would. So that's a little bit of the software tools, but don't forget the programs because they're super important as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have another question, which is, what are some community ROIs that I should cover in my initial presentation for the executives?
That's a good question. It depends on the maturity of your community. So if you're a brand new community, you want to show volume. How many people are signing up? How many questions are being posted? The amount of time it takes to get a question answered. Those are some of the metrics that you want to track early on. And those are more of your community metrics. You're always going to want to track those. You're also going to want to start tracking more of the pseudo math that I did here on the screen before, which was, how do you calculate the hard ROI, the real dollar value savings? And that'll come in the number of cases deflected. So understanding how much a case costs at your company. And we have some tools, some ROI calculators. There's spreadsheets and things that you can use. The numbers that I made up for this presentation, you can actually take that calculator and plug in real numbers from your company. Because if you can turn around and say, hey, we had this much, so for an internal company, we had 4,000 questions asked last time. We ran a survey before and after we put this tool in place. We're saving about 25 minutes per question. Here's how many questions were asked. We saved 2,000 hours. Here's the average salary of our developer at an hourly rate multiplied by that 2,000, and boom, you've got a dollar number, right? They're going to want to see that. But always be tracking the vibrancy, who's contributing and who's not. And so you should have dashboards and things set up to track that stuff and report that back to management.
Good question. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Jesse. We are almost out of time, so I will close the presentation for today. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. With that, I would like to thank Jesse for a great presentation. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today, and we hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Thank you very much, and have a good day, all.